What if everything you are watching right now is supposed to fail? What if the war, the chaos, the economic pressure, even the global instability are not mistakes, but the plan itself? Because if that sounds insane, then good. That is exactly how it is supposed to sound. It begins with a contradiction. On one side of the world, leaders step in front of their nations with a very different tone. They warn their people, fuel prices will rise, living costs will increase, there will be pain, but they promise to manage it to soften the blow. To guide their countries through controlled decline, it is careful, measured, predictable, and then there is Donald Trump. He does the opposite. He steps forward and projects absolute confidence. The economy is strong, it is improving, victory is close. The enemy will be hit harder than ever before. Everything is under control. But there is a strange tension beneath those words, because history teaches us something uncomfortable. The louder a leader claims victory, the more uncertain that victory usually is. At the exact moment when caution would make sense, escalation begins instead. Talk of intensified strikes. Possible attacks on critical infrastructure, even whispers of a ground invasion, not a de-escalation, but an acceleration. And suddenly, the situation stops looking strategic and starts looking chaotic. To most people, the conclusion is obvious. This is what incompetence looks like. A leader fighting a war in Iran that many experts say cannot be won, at the same time provoking allies, creating tension with NATO, picking disputes with Canada, pressuring Denmark over Greenland, clashing with countries across Latin America. It feels scattered, reactionary, even irrational, and so the narrative forms. Trump is reckless, Trump is impulsive, Trump does not think ahead. But there is a problem with that explanation. It is too easy. Because history has shown us something again and again. In moments when entire systems are about to change, leadership often appears indistinguishable from chaos. Decisions seem contradictory, actions look self-destructive, nothing seems to align. Until much later, when those same actions are reinterpreted as deliberate. So the real question is not whether this looks chaotic. The real question is whether the chaos itself is the strategy. Because if you zoom out, a pattern begins to emerge. Why escalate a war that is widely considered unwinnable? Why create friction with allies at the exact moment you might need them most? Why stretch military attention across multiple regions? These are not isolated decisions, they are signals, and signals suggest intent. In game theory, there is a concept known as strategic irrationality. A player deliberately behaves in ways that seem unpredictable or even self-destructive. Not because they lack intelligence, but because it forces everyone else into uncertainty. It disrupts expectations. It breaks the logic that opponents rely on. And in that confusion, power begins to shift. What if every contradiction you are seeing is not a mistake? What if it is a message? Because if that is true, then we are not watching a leader lose control. We are watching someone change the rules of the game itself. And once you begin to see it that way, a far more unsettling possibility emerges. What if the goal is not to win? To understand what is happening, you have to begin with a simple, uncomfortable truth. A ground war in Iran is not just difficult, it is almost impossible to win. This is not speculation, it is geography. Iran is not Iraq, it is not Afghanistan, it is something far more complex. A vast, mountainous fortress designed by nature itself to resist invasion. The Zagros Mountains stretch across the country like a natural wall, creating endless choke points. Ambush zones and defensive strongholds. Any advancing force would be forced into narrow corridors where they can be isolated, surrounded, and slowly destroyed. And if you avoid the mountain, you face the deserts. Endless exposed terrain where supply lines stretch thin and vulnerable, where heat, distance, and logistics become enemies just as dangerous as any army. Every mile forward becomes exponentially more expensive. Every delay becomes a liability. Now let us consider the numbers and the massive scale of the commitment required. At this moment, the United States has tens of thousands of troops positioned in the region. On paper, it sounds significant. In reality, it is nowhere near enough to occupy a country the size and terrain of Iran. Not without massive escalation, not without committing to a long, drawn-out conflict that could last years, even decades. And then there's the strategy of the defender. Iran does not need to win a conventional war. It only needs to survive. Through guerrilla warfare, through drone strikes, through artillery, through attrition. The goal is not to defeat the invading force head-on, but to bleed it slowly, to make the cost of occupation unbearable, to turn time itself into a weapon. This is the lesson America has already learned before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, wars that were supposed to be quick became endless. So when analysts look at Iran, the conclusion is almost unanimous. A ground invasion would be a strategic mistake. And yet, the signals keep pointing in that direction. Troop buildups, reserve mobilizations, logistics preparation, even subtle indicators that seem almost absurd on the surface. Increased activity within military planning hubs. Behavioral shifts that suggest something larger is coming. It is as if the system is preparing for a war that everyone agrees should not happen. Which leads to a paradox. Why prepare for a war you cannot win? Because there are only two possible answers. Either the decision makers are completely irrational, or they are operating with a different objective entirely. Now consider another layer. Beyond the battlefield itself lies a critical pressure point. The global energy system, narrow maritime routes that control the flow of oil. Arteries of the global economy that, if disrupted, can send shockwaves across continents. Control these routes and you do not just influence a region, you influence the entire world. But here is the problem. These choke points are extremely vulnerable. Close to hostile territory, easily mined, easily targeted. Any attempt to secure them would immediately escalate tensions. It would invite retaliation. It would deepen the conflict. In other words, even the economic objective is unstable. So again, the same question returns, why move forward anyway? Unless the instability itself is the goal. Because if you step back far enough, a different pattern begins to emerge. Not a plan for victory, but a plan for pressure. Not a strategy to stabilize the system, but a strategy to push it toward breaking point. And once you consider that possibility, the entire situation changes. This is no longer about whether a war can be won. It is about what happens when a war is designed to reshape everything around it. If this were just a war, the signals would be simple. Troops move, battles begin, objectives are defined, victory or defeat follows. But what we are seeing does not behave like a normal war, it behaves like preparation. Quietly, almost invisibly, the pieces begin to shift into place. Tens of thousands of troops are already positioned across the Middle East, not just deployed, but staged, ready, waiting. And behind them, something even more telling begins to unfold. Communication channels activate. Reserve forces receive signals to prepare, not suggestions, but instructions. Be ready to deploy, be ready to fight, be ready to win. That phrase matters. Because you do not mobilize reserves for a short conflict. You mobilize them for something longer. Something heavier, something that cannot be contained quickly, and yet the public narrative remains strangely disconnected from these actions. Everything is under control, victory is near, the contradiction deepens. But then there are the more unusual signals, the ones that seem almost ridiculous at first glance, until you realize how often they have appeared before major military operations. In past conflicts, analysts noticed a strange pattern: late nights inside the Pentagon, extended planning sessions, and with them something mundane but revealing. A spike in food deliveries, pizza orders increasing dramatically as teams worked around the clock. It sounds trivial, but war is not just fought on battlefields. It is built in rooms, in maps, in simulations, in sleepless nights where decisions are made long before the first shot is fired. And alongside that, another signal: behavioral shifts. Spaces that are normally active become quiet. Social patterns change. Attention narrows. Focus intensifies. It is as if an entire system is subconsciously preparing for something it cannot yet openly declare. Then there is the market, prediction markets, where people place real money on future events. Begin to show something unusual: large bets, not guesses, but calculated risks. Individuals wagering hundreds of thousands of dollars on the likelihood of a ground invasion. And here is what makes that significant. People do not place that kind of money on uncertainty. They place it when they believe they know something, when they believe the outcome is not just possible, but probable. So now the signals are everywhere: military buildup, reserve activation, unusual behavioral indicators, financial bets aligning toward the same conclusion. Individually, each one can be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns are hard to ignore. But here is where it becomes even more strange. At the exact same time, all of this is happening. The United States is not consolidating its position. It is expanding tension elsewhere. North America, pressure on Canada, friction with Mexico, strategic interest in Greenland, renewed focus on control of key regions across the Western Hemisphere. It is as if two different strategies are unfolding at once, one in the Middle East, one at home. And they do not seem connected, unless they are. Because if you think about it differently, this is not about fighting one war. It is about reshaping multiple regions simultaneously, applying pressure externally while restructuring internally. And suddenly the contradictions begin to align. The war is not isolated, the tensions are not random, They are synchronized, which leads to a possibility that is far more unsettling than simple conflict. What if the goal is not to manage the system, but to overload it? Because systems do not collapse from a single point of failure. They collapse when multiple pressures hit at once: economic, military, political, social. All converging, all accelerating, until the system can no longer sustain itself. And if that is what we are witnessing, then this is no longer preparation for war. This is preparation for transformation. There is a moment in history that explains everything you are seeing right now. Not today, not last year, but 1991. The Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and suddenly, for the first time in modern history, the United States stands alone at the top of the world. No rival, no equal, no balance. And in that moment, America does something unprecedented. It redesigns the global system. The idea was simple and incredibly ambitious. First, America would become the financial brain of the world. Not the factory, not the workshop, the brain. Manufacturing would move overseas, resources would be extracted elsewhere, and in return, the United States would control capital. Money flows, debt, investment. Wall Street becomes the center of gravity, and the dollar becomes the language everyone must speak. Second, the world would no longer be divided by identity, not culture, not religion, not borders, but by consumption. What unites people is not who they are, but what they buy. A global culture built on shopping, entertainment, and endless economic growth. If everyone is busy consuming, then no one has time to fight. And third, America would guarantee the entire system. Every trade route, every shipment of oil, every critical pathway across the oceans, protected. This is Pax Americana, a world where peace is not natural, but enforced. And for a while, it works. Globalization explodes, trade expands, wealth increases, the system looks unstoppable. But underneath, something begins to rot. Factories disappear from American cities, entire communities hollow out, the middle class starts to fracture. And slowly, almost invisibly, the United States shifts from being a producer to being a consumer. It stops making things and starts buying everything. At the same time, the cost of maintaining this global system keeps rising. Military bases across the world, endless commitments, endless responsibilities. America is no longer just leading the system, it is carrying it. And then, eventually, a dangerous question emerges. What if this entire system is a bad deal? What if the United States is not benefiting from globalization, but being drained by it? And this is where everything changes. Because what you are seeing today is not random chaos. It is rejection, a rejection of the world that was built after 1991. The logic flips completely. Why protect allies who can protect themselves? Why secure trade routes for countries that compete against you? Why rely on global supply chains that can break overnight? Why stay inside a system that makes you weaker? So instead of maintaining the system, you start pulling away from it. You challenge alliances that once seemed untouchable. You create friction where there used to be cooperation. You shift focus away from finance and back toward real things. Energy, resources, manufacturing, things you can control, things you can survive with. And then comes the most uncomfortable shift of all. You stop trying to stabilize the world. Because stability is expensive, and instability can be useful. Because when the global system becomes unstable, something interesting happens. Everyone else becomes desperate for energy, for security, for resources. And suddenly, the country that can provide those things becomes the center again. Not through cooperation, but through necessity. So what if the chaos you are seeing, the conflicts, the tensions, the breakdown of alliances, is not a collapse that needs to be stopped, but a collapse that is being allowed, even accelerated? Because if the old world order is being dismantled on purpose, then the real story is not about what is ending. It is about what is being built in its place. And whatever that new system is, it will not look anything like the one we thought would last forever. Now we arrive at the part that changes everything. Because if the old world is being dismantled, then something else must be taking its place. And that something is not global, it is regional. More specifically, it is North America. To understand this, you have to shift your perspective. Stop thinking about dominance over the entire world and start thinking about survival inside a collapsing one. Because if globalization breaks, if trade routes become unstable, if energy flows are disrupted, then most of the world faces a simple problem. Dependence on imports, on fragile supply chains, on resources they do not control. But there is one region that is different, North America. A region with vast energy reserves, fertile land, fresh water, industrial capacity, strategic depth, protected by two oceans, isolated yet connected internally. In other words, a system that can survive on its own, a self-sufficient bloc, what some have begun to call a technate. Not an empire that stretches across continents, but a fortress that does not need them. And suddenly, the actions that once looked chaotic begin to align. Pressure on Canada is not random. It is about integration of resources. Tension with Mexico is not accidental. It is about control of manufacturing and labor flows. Interest in Greenland is not symbolic. It is about securing strategic territory, minerals, and Arctic access. Even the focus on Latin America begins to make sense, because when you draw the map differently, you do not see separate countries. You see a single potential system, energy from the north, agriculture from the heartland, labor and production across the south, maritime control across both oceans, a closed loop, self-sustaining, resilient, and most importantly, independent from the chaos outside. Now go back to the war, because this is where it all connects. If the Middle East becomes unstable, energy prices spike. If global supply chains fracture, Europe and Asia struggle. If traditional systems break down, dependence increases. And in that moment, the region that can provide stability becomes the most powerful. So what if the war is not meant to be won? What if it is meant to destabilize the very system that competitors rely on? Because from that instability, a new center emerges. Not global, but regional. And that brings us to the final uncomfortable realization. Maybe the goal was never to preserve the American empire. Maybe the goal is to end it, to dismantle the responsibilities, the burdens, the endless commitments, and replace it with something leaner, stronger, more focused, a system built not to manage the world, but to outlast it. And if that is true, then the question changes completely. This is no longer about whether the strategy is reckless, it is about whether it works. Because if it does, then history may not remember this as chaos. It may remember it as design, and the man at the center of it, not as a fool, but as the architect of a new world. And if this perspective made you see things differently, even just for a moment, then it was worth it. Thank you for watching, and if you want to explore more ideas like this, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more than you think.